So welcome everyone. My name is Yasmin Kurzi. My pronouns are she and her. I'm a Latina woman with light skin, brown hair, and brown eyes, wearing a brown shirt. I'm an assistant professor at the FGV Law School in Rio de Janeiro and a postdoctoral researcher at the Digital Technology for Democracy Lab, or DTD Lab, here at the University of Virginia. Together with my colleague and mentor, Jess Rea, an assistant professor of data science and public policy at UVA, and one of the faculty co-leads at the UVA DTD Lab, we are organizing the Gender in Tech online talk series to discuss how gender shapes and is shaped by technologies, incorporating perspectives from the global majority. Our aim here is to bring together scholars, practitioners, and advocates to explore how our work can contribute to advancing democracy and human rights. Today, we are hosting the 7th webinar of the series where we aim to discuss this misinformation and political extremism. We are fortunate to have two fantastic experts on these topics, Rosana Pinheiro Machado and Robin Kaplan, who have been leading research on these areas. We hope that the community we are building here will be another space to help us navigate the techno-authoritarian agenda that is quickly spreading in many countries. Thanks to the amazing response we had last year, the Gender in Tech online talk series continues until April 2026. We'll host three webinars in this occasion. The next one is on digital transformation on February 24. And we will also have a session on immigration and techno-authoritarianism in March, ending with a discussion about possible AI futures in April. So to conclude our series, we will release a report after the series ends that builds upon all the topics that were covered in the series and our current research as well. The publication will be open access and available in late 2026. So for today's webinar, we recognize that English is not the first language for many of us, so please feel free to ask questions in Portuguese, Spanish, or French. We'll do our best to translate them. And you can use also the Q&A feature located at the bottom of the screen to ask questions. We also turned on the automated closed captions, and you can also keep up with the conversation using them. The recording will be available on the UVA DTD Labs YouTube channel in the next couple of days. Thank you all again for being here with us in this one more session. Next, we will hear from Jess Rea, who will moderate the conversation today. Thank you so much for being here. Thanks, Jess.
Thanks, Yasmin. Hi, everyone. Welcome. Thank you so much for being here with us. I'm Jess. My pronouns are they, them, and I'm a Brazilian person with light skin and red hair wearing a black shirt. And so, as Yasmin said, I'm an assistant professor at UVA. Have been working with the DTG Lab for a couple of years now. And this series aims to center feminist, gender nonconforming, and global majority perspectives as much as possible in this debate on technology, democracy, and human rights. And so on today's session, we'll explore the role of digital technology in the crisis of trust in democracy and institutions worldwide, and the focus is on the rise of an organized global far right and the weaponization of information at scale to produce harm to democracy and public institutions, with like a special attention to other regions like outside of North America and Europe as well. And so we hope to discuss the possibilities of recreating narratives about free speech and human rights protections in this age of datafication. We are honored to welcome two brilliant speakers whose work has deeply shaped this debate so far. We have Rosana Pinheiro Machado and Robbie Kaplan, and so I'll introduce them briefly. Rosana Pinheiro Machado, who is a social scientist and an anthropologist and currently works as a professor of global studies in the School of Geography at University College Dublin. Rosana is also the director of the Digital Economy and Extreme Politics Lab, GEP Lab, where she leads a team of PhD students, affiliated researchers, postdocs, and visiting scholars. She's also a consolidator grantee of the European Research Council and the external coordinator of the Abdias Nascimento Grant from CAPES in Brazil, which promotes the international mobility of Black and Indigenous Brazilian candidates. And prior to joining UCG, she had appointments at the University of Bath, the University of São Paulo, the University of Oxford, and Harvard University. She has published over 80 papers, chapters, and books, and has given approximately 200 invited talks in Europe, United States, Latin America, and Asia, including several prestigious keynote speeches at major international conference. So thanks again, Rosanna, for being here. And we also have Robin Kaplan, who is an assistant professor at Duke University Stanford School of Public Policy and a senior lecturing fellow in the Center for Science and Society at Duke University. She's also a researcher affiliated at Data and Society Research Institute, where she worked as a senior researcher, and unaffiliated at the Center for Information Technology and Policy and UNC Chapel Hill, and a founding member of the Platform Governance Research Network. She received her PhD from the School of Communication Information at Rutgers University, and she conducts research at the intersection of platform governance and media policy. Her research examines the impact of inter- and intra-organization behavior on platform governance and content moderation. In her most recent work, she examines the history of the verified badge, the blue checkmark at platforms. Kaplan's work has been published in journals such as the International Journal of Communication, Social Media Society, First Monday, Big Data Society, and Feminist Media Studies. And also her work has been featured in publications like the Washington Post, New York Times, Wired, Al Jazeera, and NBC. So thanks, Robbie, as well, for being here. We can begin with Rosanna's remarks. So Rosanna, thank you, and please go ahead whenever you're ready.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for coming. My pronouns are she, her. I'm Latin woman with light skin, long straight hair, and I'm wearing black jacket. I'd like to thank Jazz and Yasmin for the invitation. It's really, really great pleasure to be here today with you all, with this large audience and my colleague Robin. So I don't know if you can see anything because I don't see my screen. Okay, can you see? Okay. So now I can see the screen. So the election of rage bait as the word of the year by Oxford Dictionary took place exactly while I was writing about the limits of rage, and more specifically, the limits of rage generated by social media to explain the rise of the far right. So my talk today, in a way, benefits from this coincidence, and I'd like to share my 2 cents on the concept from the perspective of my long-term ethnographic experience. And this is also a way to introduce my research to you. So, but I'm having problems in sharing my screen. So, can you see now? Yes, I think so. I think you are, yes?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. So over the last 20 years, I've been studying many subjects, of course, and but mostly low-income groups in the global south, especially Brazil, China, and specifically in the last 10 years, doing research among far-right supporters. This is more focused on Brazil, and in the last 3-4 years, I was combining ethnographic work with extensive computational approaches in Brazil, India, and the Philippines, also studying precarious workers and the far-right support. So I want to reflect about the idea of rage bait based on this ethnographic and long ethnographic trajectory focus on ordinary people, real people, conquered people in their daily lives. The very idea of rage bait is part of something that I consider a big problem. The way that the so-called fake news became a discourse, for example, in a Foucauldian way, formed in academia, in the public sphere, in policy making. And the discourse treats this and misinformation as the main problem of our time. And this we saw this in reports by Economic World Forum and UNESCO, for example. And within this discourse, a new consensus was formed that the rise of the far right is caused by social media and evil algorithm, that platforms destroy trust in democracy, manufacturing rage by dividing people and making them angry through this or misinformation. And of course, misinformation is one of the most pressing problems of our time. Nobody would disagree that the harms it causes. But the problem is the apparatus mobilized by the discourse itself. It is male technocratic, it is technical fetishized, it is depoliticized and detached from the experience of ordinary people. And the result, failure, the systematic failure of solutions in debunking this misinformation. So today in social science, in computer science, we have a huge advancement in understanding how misinformation, hateful speech spreads. We know with some precision, with enough evidence, the speed at which hateful and false content circulates. We know how likely it's going to be shared, liked, and amplified compared to non-arousing factual content. And this is all true. The problem with this perspective, it is not that it is incorrect. The problem with this perspective, it is that it is partial. And it is limited in two ways, and my two arguments in this brief talk today are these two. First, we know a lot about the infrastructure that allows rage to flourish, but we forget the very concrete foundations where rage is built. Human beings, everyday life, power structures, material inequalities. The second point, we focus too much on rage production and misinformation, and consequently on negative emotions like frustration. The whole literature on the far right, 95%, if you do any quick systematic review, the emotional categories that we see are frustration, threat, hate, resentment, anger. Of course, far right is about violence, so I'm not denying or criticizing this. This is a critical part of the study of the far right, and I would say a critical part of my own work on emotional aspects of the far right. The problem is that we know very little about how authoritarian populists use social media and digital platforms in much more profound and dangerous ways. Not only by producing rage, but also by mobilizing dreams and positive emotions. So I will try to unpack these two brief arguments now in 5 minutes more or less for each. So I start with my first point, how rage bait makes sense in everyday life. Over all these years of field work, I've learned something very, very, very simple and basic. People do not feel rage toward abstract enemies created on social media or simply starting hating the immigrants, as mainstream disinformation discourse often suggests. The tech discourse on social media might be obscuring the most basic of all problems, human relationships, the people. And by neglecting them, we miss the very structural foundations through which rage is sedimented. Rage is, I argue in my book, a parochial emotion. People feel rage toward a perceived broken world, a perceived loss, a perceived abandonment. And these people resentment are directed at, let's say, 3 levels. The first level would be acquaintance, the immigrant's neighbors, the immigrant who is a neighbor, poor relatives who are perceived as receiving more welfare social benefits than themselves, or the so-called free riders, leeches, bloodsuckers, lazy people. One of the chapters of my book is called The Lazy Cousin. It's about the stories, so many stories that I heard over all these years, people saying, I work so hard and my lazy cousin gets everything from government. And this is one layer, the first level of relationships. The second one is also directed at the people who challenge patriarchal norms and white supremacy. and I'm going to give an example soon. Third, at the third level through which rage is directed at is at the politicians, who are seen as inefficient, corrupt, or absent. This rage against anti-establishment is not new, but is also portrayed now as something new. It is as old as marginalization itself. We have learned that distrusting liberal democracy is a new phenomenon and that social media is part responsible for this corrosion. In countries like in the Global South, this is not the case. The welfare state, the rule of law, liberal democracy have been a fiction. Low-income groups in the Global South, but also more and more in the Global North, have historically experienced the state as inefficient, violent, and absent. And what you saw in the US in the last weekend is a good example of this. In addition, beneath these aspects lies what I call precarious entitlement. Certain strata of people these people are usually poor but above the poverty line, they believe they are superior to those who receive benefits and attention from the state. They see themselves as hardworking, more productive, more deserving, and yet ignored, neglected. What the populists do through social media is soothe egos. They point the finger at enemies. They say, oh, the problem is them. The problem is not you. And this them is usually always someone even weaker or even more marginalized, or a vague idea of the system or the establishment. But this makes people feel they are better. If someone is marginalized, someone is the problem, the enemy, it makes you to feel a little bit better. So this is the role of rage bait. In all these years of ethnographic observation of people sharing news, sitting with people, having little coffee with Brazilian coffee with people, having a chat, being in their houses, I have never seen anyone share content because they truly believe it was factually true. The true is not the point. We know these several anthropologists, and we have like so many people writing about this. When Dani, my key interlocutor, shares the claim that Brigitte Marcon is a transgender woman, he is not making a factual statement. He is expressing his inability to tolerate a world in which his teenage daughter questions binary sexuality. This is a new world to him, with new narratives and policies that support her choices. And this became unbearable. This is why debunking disinformation works so slowly and fails so much. Because truth in this case, in this specific case, where rage is sedimented in concrete life, is secondary. What matters is reaffirmation of individual beliefs. Misinformation through digital spreading infrastructures creates a patchwork repertoire that people use it to anchor lost certainty and perceived injustice. So people start getting here and there and making and composing a repertoire that makes sense to that sense of lost world. So this repertoire gives order to the world, it makes sense, it creates community. Often around legitimate grievances, not always legitimate grievances, but most of the time we are talking about ordinary people who at the end of the day are still the marginalized. Misinformation accelerates and intensifies pre-existing rage. It transforms it and gives also new meaning to it. And this brings to my second and final point. But just a parenthesis here, when I'm talking about working class and the poor, it's because my work is on political extremism, far right, and the digital platforms among the working class. That's why I'm focusing here on the working class. So when we attribute the main political problems of extremism only to disinformation, we are missing another thing very important. So we miss about how authoritarian populists use digital platforms beyond rage bait and political lies. And much of the literature, as I mentioned before, on the so-called fake news and radicalization focuses almost exclusively on negative emotions. But this is also, again, analytically insufficient because authoritarian populists also mobilize positive emotions, which we'd call, let's say, aspiration bait, dreams, prosperity, autonomy, pride, belonging, etc., etc. So negative emotions structure grievances, but they don't explain why authoritarianism feels attractive and meaningful in everyday life. We have learned over one century of history, and here I'm citing Carpolani in the essence of fascism, that the glue of fascism is also the magic. What gives it traction, it is its promise to transform people who have long been treated as nobodies into somebody, visible, recognized, worthy. So social media has developed a giant ecosystem of influencers who act as ambassadors of Silicon Valley, big tech, and libertarian values of an unregulated economy. This ecosystem that I'm summarizing briefly here in this image because I don't have time to explain, but I'm talking about a massive universe, has the monopoly of digital entrepreneurship. So today, in many parts of the world, especially in Latin America, it's very hard to start a digital business on social media without falling the trap of these far-right coaches. They create an appealing universe for the majority of the world, and this is done in more subtle ways than through misinformation. And that's where the problem lies. The problem, they promise wealth and autonomy to millions. They promise that everyone will be the 1%. They gain terrain where people have experienced humiliation, invisibility, degrading jobs. It showcases a new possible, completely new possible life, full of wealth and autonomy and freedom. And the sad thing here is that it attracts hundreds of millions of people in the global south seeking financial opportunities. So our computational and platform-based data strongly reinforce this. Large-scale analysis of Instagram profiles in Brazil shows that aspirational language dominates digital cultures. So here are just some examples in a database that we are creating of over 1 million aspiring digital entrepreneurs, of those people attending workshops of coach influencers on how to be rich, for example. One of the most frequent words among the top 10 words is CEO. We are talking about cake makers, manicurists, street vendors, Uber drivers. We identify a huge subjectivity transformation among the poor in Brazil, which we call the CEO myth, and I don't have time to explore this, but just some images about my long-term interlocutors who were previous Lula Workers' Party voters. Now they are all drawn into this universe of digital entrepreneurship, saying, embody this new VIP or CEO personality. I could talk about it about like 1-2 hours. So, but this is a care worker who defined herself as a feminicide survivor, and now after she started joining this universe of digital entrepreneurship and following the codes, she said that she cannot use that victim label anymore, and now she defines herself as an entrepreneur, although she still works as a care worker. Yeah, so it seems that the other slide that I wanted to show, it is not here, but I'm finishing anyway. So our lab estimates that around one in 3 Brazilian workers is attempting to build an income on Instagram. And Brazil, many people know, has the highest number of influencers globally. So in a recent ethnographic incursion, I attended an online workshop on how to become a millionaire, run by an English coach. It had over 100,000 participants from all over the world. And all saying, I want to be VIP, I wanted to be, because this was the slogan, I wanted to be the 1%. This has become, and we are talking about immigrants, racialized people, low-income people. This has become a massive, unregulated phenomenon. At first glance, this looks purely economic. There's no fake news about Lula, Brigitte Macron, or Biden here. It looks like lifestyle, but this is profoundly political for several ways. Quantitative mapping of influencer networks shows that around 90% of top entrepreneurial coach influencers in Brazil, but also similar numbers in other countries, align with the far right. So 9 in each 10 coach influencers are far right supporters. So here we have a mass phenomenon here in which we have millions and millions, 100 million people eager for entrepreneurial opportunities and digital opportunities to escape poverty and to have financial freedom, following a trap completely dominated by a monopoly of far-right supporters. So these influences promote a moralized, hyper-individualistic discourse on effort, merit, and self-transformation, while delegitimizing labor rights, unions, and public welfare. Platforms are not just infrastructures of rage, as I mentioned, they are infrastructures of aspiration. They cultivate, visualize, exploit, and monetize dreams of wealth, freedom, and self-worth within ecosystems marked by opaque propaganda and advertising and anti-ethical practices. Authoritarian populism succeeds because it captures imagination, it offers emotionally compelling answers to structural insecurity. Not collective solutions, but hyper-individualized and selfish dreams of escape. So finally, by arguing that misinformation is a new discourse of our time, I'm not undermining its serious harms, the opposite, but calling attention to the fact that the very creation of the discourse diverts us from addressing something more profound, the root cause of the political division. And one of the causes is the very power of big tech and digital platforms to encapsulate emotions across broad spectrum, from rage to dreams, and how they are creating a new world that mirrors their values. Yes, digital platforms corrode trust in democracy, not only manufacturing rage, but also hijacking imagination in the future. Misinformation harms democracy in profound ways by resonating with pre-existing concrete structural discontent and exacerbating and organizing that everyday rage. But the power of social media, articulated with authoritarian populists, also lies in mobilizing the vital energy of global majorities. And we know very little about this, while we know a lot about rage mobilization. So to finish my brief talk, if there is something positive in this talk, it is the fact that the emotions that I'm talking here that are being mobilized, indignation and the desire for autonomy, are at the roots legitimate and can be contested in new political directions. Thank you so much. I hope I could keep my times.
Yes, you did great. Thank you so much, Rosanna, for such a wonderful presentation. It's great to see this kind of ethnographic work about Brazil and this new business model emerging market of rage bait. And without further ado, I want to invite Robin to present now. So please, the floor is yours.
I actually think our presentations fit very well together. So I'm very pleased with that. Okay, so I'm Robin Kaplan. I'm a professor at Duke University in the School of Public Policy. I do work across a broad range of topics related to platform governance and media policy, and I mostly look at how content standards are made and enforced. And I try and look at it across a broad array of stakeholders. So I study it from the perspective of platforms, or I study it from the perspective of organizations trying to influence those standards, from users who experience it, and so forth. I am a white woman from Canada, and I have long, straight brown hair, and I'm wearing a creamish sweater. And I also want to thank the organizers for having me, Jess and Yasmin, and my fellow presenter, Rosanna. All right, so like a lot of people these days, I've been looking to the past to understand the current moment that we're living in. And part of that work for me has been asking how long we've been living in what we call the current moment. So much of what we treat as novel, our crises of trust, authority, and governance, have been unfolding slowly across decades, often in ways that we've failed to name at the time. One thinker who has been useful for me in making sense of this, and I think for many people, has been Hannah Arendt. Arendt said many things, often controversially and not always consistently, but I've been particularly interested in her essay, What is Authority? And what she argues happens when societies lose authority. Now, Arendt has a very specific definition of authority. So for her, authority is not force, nor is it persuasion. She notes that when authority collapses, force and persuasion tend to rush in to fill the gap. And she's sharply critical of what she calls the modern cynical equation of authority with obedience, an understanding that she associates with authoritarianism. These substitutes, she argues, disguise the nature of authority rather than restoring it. Authority, for Arendt, names a relationship in which people accept guidance without coercion or argument because they trust the source of judgment. It's not something that one possesses, but something that exists between people. It requires trust from those in weaker positions, but also trustworthiness from those who exercise authority, and acceptance of responsibility, restraint, and accountability. Importantly, this raises questions not only about the loss of authority, but about whose judgment was ever trusted as authoritative in the first place. So at this point, you're probably wondering what any of this has to do with misinformation. I was told I could speak about platform governance instead of just misinformation, or even feminism, because there's rarely a feminist defense of authority. But what I want to suggest today is that this absence is itself telling, and that a feminist engagement with Arendt's account of authority can help us understand why contemporary systems of governance, especially platform governance, so often substitute procedure, metrics, and enforcement for judgment and trust. And I would argue, as I think many would, that platforms and many other institutions face an authority crisis, not because publics have suddenly withdrawn trust or because social media has somehow caused that distrust. There's a lot of evidence that social media emerged out of those same movements of distrust, but because these institutions are widely understood to be acting strategically rather than responsibly. This is true in the States, where there's been kind of a lot of research on these declines in trust since the 1960s, really since trust started being measured, but also globally as well. But this is not a crisis of misplaced skepticism. It's a historically grounded response to repeated experiences in which political, financial, judicial, and informational institutions have failed to act in ways that warrant trust in the first place. In this context, we can understand the far right gaining traction, not because they're trustworthy, but because they perform good faith and responsiveness in a political environment where institutions are widely understood to have failed to do so, even as far right claims to authority remain exclusionary and coercive. So, if authority requires trust, then what we describe as misinformation problems are actually problems of authority in the Arendtian sense. This isn't a new claim. We've been circling it for some time. But the argument that I want to make today is this. Platforms imagine governance as a discretionary act. They believe that they can choose whether to listen, determine when participation matters, and define the rules and procedures that govern shared spaces. But platforms operate within a distributed field of power, in which authority is never really theirs to grant or withhold. When platforms refuse to listen, alternative forms of authority do not disappear. Rather, they emerge anyway, through communities, mutual judgment, and collective response. This is not inherently emancipatory. The same conditions that produce care-based, feminist, and solidaristic forms of authority, like we see on the right, through mutual aid practices, also give rise to exclusionary, reactionary, and far-right claims of authority. Here's my argument for this talk that I think is a little bit controversial. I think we are partially to blame here, as scholars and as a community. Whether consciously or not, we, including myself, have tended to articulate platform governance through a Weberian lens, treating platforms as the primary and often sole locus of power, or alternatively positioning the state as the only meaningful countervailing force. In doing so, we have reproduced a model of governance that assumes authority must be centralized, formally located, and institutionally possessed, even as empirical work has repeatedly shown governance to be dispersed, negotiated, and exercised across a much wider terrain. So this goes back to kind of the history of platform governance as a field. Early efforts to define platform governance focused on how platforms both govern and are governed. So Tarleton Gillespie, in this major piece, conceptualized these dynamics as governance by platforms. So the way that platforms govern their users, like terms of service, community guidelines, and interface design, and governance of platforms. So the authority exercised over platforms by states and other institutional actors. These distinctions have been foundational, but they do not fully capture how authority is distributed and exercised in practice. To do so, theories of platform governance must also account for governance through platforms and governance over platforms. And what do I mean by that? So by governance through platforms, I'm referring to forms of authority that operate via platform infrastructure rather than originating in platform rule making. And by governance through platforms, I refer to authority that operates by means of platform infrastructures rather than originating from platform ownership or formal rulemaking. So the example here would be community moderation for the former, and then interpretive in the acts of interpretation by users in the latter. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. By governance over platforms, I refer to directional pressure that shapes governance outcomes above or around platform intentions. Sorry, and that example is how users actively interpret platform policies, algorithms, and what the platform is and what it claims authority over. Through Arendt's account of authority, this distinction matters. Governance can persist and even intensify under conditions where authority has collapsed. What Arendt helps us see is that the proliferation of rules, procedures, metrics, and enforcement mechanisms are not evidence of authority's presence, but often a symptom of its absence. And platform governance has helped explain why extensive forms of participation, interpretation, and contestation coexist with deep mistrust in platforms and the state's capacity to decide legitimately. Governance continues, but authority does not. And this is precisely the condition that Arendt was describing. Rule without legitimacy and decision without trusted judgment. All right, so why haven't we really considered this before as part of how platforms are governed? So platforms governance has long recognized extensive user participation, but it's treated participation primarily as input into governance systems rather than as participation in governance itself. So users participate by flagging content, moderating communities, generating behavioral signals, and producing metrics that are interpreted by both platforms and regulators. As this kind of work shows, these practices are consequential. They distribute responsibility, discipline users, and help legitimate platform decisions. And yet theories of platform governance have not fully incorporated the role of users and other stakeholders as participants in the production of governing norms, authority, and legitimacy themselves. The gap is not the recognition that users participate, but rather the acknowledgement that participation, interpretation, and refusal by users is constitutive of governance. So I guess mine is a little bit more hopeful. So this view of platform governance draws on the political scientist Joel Migdal's state and society approach. Although Migdal develops this framework to theorize the state and platforms are decidedly not states, his account offers a way to make sense of governing formations characterized by internal fragmentation, contested authority, and porous boundaries. Migdal emphasizes the tension between viewing the state as a clearly bounded, unified organization that can be spoken of in singular terms, and understanding it as the practice of a heap of loosely connected parts or fragments, marked by ill-defined boundaries and competing rule systems that often conflict with each other and official law. Read as an account of governance rather than sovereignty, the state and society approach provides a useful lens for understanding platforms as non-sovereign governing formations, whose rules, authority, and legitimacy emerge through ongoing struggles with social actors both inside and outside the platforms. While platforms retain a structurally dominant position in shaping infrastructure and policies, treating them as omnipotent actors risks reproducing the same analytic error that Migdal identifies in the reception of Weber's ideal type state, the image of a totalized authority that obscures how governing power is exercised, contested, and constrained in practice. There's a significant amount of scholarship that positions users as active participants, interpreters, shapers, and resistors of platform governance. Community moderation is perhaps the most visible and institutionally legitimate form of user authority and resistance. Work done by Nate Matthias, for example, has demonstrated the power of collective action taken by subreddit moderators to influence the platform operator, Reddit. And volunteer moderation has long been recognized as either part of the civic fabric of the internet or as a form of unpaid and exploitative labor in digital economies. This has been true, particularly in contexts like Wikipedia and Reddit, but also in more anti-social spaces like 4chan and 8chan that are nonetheless community governed, though largely through norms. Online communities do not simply follow platform rules, they actively interpret platform policies, algorithms, and what the platform is and what it claims authority over. These interpretations shape how rules are applied, ignored, or contested in practice, and thus function as a form of governance. As Migdal argues in his discussion of the state's image, governance depends not only on how authority is projected by institutions, but how it is understood and taken up by people in society. These perceptions, in turn, shape compliance, resistance, and everyday practice, and I mean that in the sense meant by Desserteau. And this is supported by work that has often been treated as tangential to platform governance, but should instead be considered central to explaining how users shape authority, meaning, and compliance. So user interpretations of platform algorithms, including algorithmic gossip, which is work done by Sophie Bishop, and folk theories of algorithms, work based off of work done by Tana Boucher, influence how community members interact with algorithmic systems. From an Arendtian perspective, these practices are not just reactions to platform power, but are exercises of judgment that emerge when institutional authority is no longer trusted to make decisions on behalf of a community. In other cases, shared user interpretations of algorithms and platform policies have informed collective resistance and mutual aid practices that attempt to redirect value away from platform priorities and towards those communities. Creators or people compensated for their content by platforms are also engaging in collective action through more institutionally traditional means, such as labor unionization. An emphasis on user interpretation also aligns with longstanding theories of active audiences and media studies, which have long complicated claims that media institutions, such as platforms, straightforwardly influence beliefs and behaviors, and has historically posed a challenge to contemporary claims about platforms' role in phenomena such as polarization. It also allows us to consider the other subversive actions taken by individuals, such as refusal to use platforms and other data collecting services, and digital silence within theories of platform governance. And it turns our attention towards the grounded realities and histories of users often viewed as peripheral to platform governance, even though these interpretations and practices actually constitute the majority of how platforms are encountered in the world. But it is important to repeat, as I noted earlier, governance through and over platforms is not inherently feminist or care-based. It reflects how existing power relations, it reflects existing power relations and can just as easily be taken up by reactionary and far-right actors. Because of the economic and cultural power that platforms and platform owners yield, it's been difficult to account for the impact of these user activities on governance. When we talk about the power of users and connected organizations, their influence is acknowledged, but ultimately treated as subordinate, operating at the pleasure of people like Elon Musk and Mark Zuckerberg, with corporate values and interests remaining the primary locus through which features and policies are determined. It's been easier within platform governance to conceptualize the role of NGOs, advocacy groups, and experts than that of users. So concepts like networked platform governance, which is based off a paper I published a couple of years ago, and the Platform Governance Triangle by Gorwa have offered ways to conceptualize how authority, influence, and legitimacy are distributed across states, firms, civil society organizations, and experts. These frameworks foreground interdependence, coordination, and negotiated responsibility among connected actors, though ultimately do not imply a symmetrical distribution of power. This move towards cooperative and distributed responsibility, however, risks reproducing or transforming the problem of accountability rather than resolving it. Responsibility becomes distributed across so many actors with such uneven forms of power that it becomes ultimately impossible to specify who is accountable for which governance outcomes. As Stoker noted, theories of networked governance can help organizations maintain flexibility and address functional needs, but it also may lead to less insight into how decisions are made in a situation where no one is in charge. What is needed then is not a return to centralized authority. Arendt would argue that that's not possible, but a way of conceptualizing governance such that all participants, platforms, states, experts, NGOs, connected businesses, and users bear responsibility for change in ways that are shared, uneven, and non-interchangeable, rather than diffuse and absolving. Migdal's state and society approach also doesn't eliminate the problem of accountability, but it redirects analytic attention toward the practices at the periphery, which Migdal argues play a far more central role in social order and change than institutional theories acknowledge. Rather than treating governance as the outcome of a centralized authority or as linear influence, a platforms and society approach would conceptualize governance as an ongoing struggle among a melange of social organizations with different values and priorities. All right, so this talk has argued that platform governance is best understood not as the exercise of authority by platforms or over platforms, but as a contested network struggle among multiple social organizations. It's made the case that definitions of platform governance need to expand beyond governance of platforms and governance by platforms, and fully consider governance over and through platforms equally as an analytic lens. It proposes a platform and society approach to governance, which builds off of work by Migdal that treats platform governance as an ongoing struggle among platforms, states, users, and other social actors. There's an important reason why I think we need to reshift conceptions of governance as a distributed field. Theories of platform governance that overly emphasize the center, so the power of platforms, don't merely describe where authority operates, but help normalize where it's imagined to reside. In doing so, they legitimate platform authority as coherent, internal, and ultimately ownable. This conceptualization has helped normalize the type of executive sovereignty that's now visible across the platform industry. So examples include the takeover of Twitter by Musk, the pulling back from trust and safety, the ending of fact-checking partnerships, and broader step-backs from accountability. The image of the platform as a coherent, unified, and authoritative actor has persisted despite evidence that rulemaking and practice is shaped by competing actors, disparate values, and uneven processes of enforcement, compliance, and legitimacy. Once authority is imagined as residing in the platform, it becomes easy, or even logical, or less ethically ambiguous for that authority to be reclaimed, consolidated, personalized, and centralized by platform owners. What I'm arguing in this talk is that we need to decenter platforms. And that doesn't mean that we need to deny their structural power. So that would be impossible. Rather, a platforms and society perspective would also consider how authority and power is constituted through how and which rules are interpreted, enacted, resisted, and legitimized by the periphery. Users, communities, and other actors exercise power by shaping how governance functions in practice. Thanks, guys. I think I made it just under 20 minutes.
Yes. Thank you so much for this fantastic presentation as well. Really appreciate this idea of platform governance going beyond the governance of and by platforms. And I'm pretty sure our audience will appreciate that as well. And everyone, please post your questions in the Q&A feature. Again, you can post questions in English, Portuguese, Spanish, and French if you feel more comfortable doing that. And to begin with, I'll ask each of you a question. I'll start with Rosanna first. Thinking, because we do have lots of students and researchers attending these webinars. And I was thinking in terms of research methods, because it's such a fascinating topic, what kind of criteria do you use to classify someone as an influencer, as a far-right influencer across the platforms you're working on? And how do you handle the boundary cases where this ideological signaling is implicit or ironic or like strategically ambiguous, for example? Like how are you creating this sample and identifying all these influencers?
Thank you, Jess, for the question. We follow the 1,000 biggest influencers in digital marketing in Brazil, and it is just by the numbers of the biggest ones. And then we do this manually through one by one through a category that we created over after 3 years of digital ethnography following these influencers. We created 6 categories between clear far right alignment, subtle far right alignment, and unclear or left leaning, because it depends. Then for each category we have lots of criteria to define, and we created this, as I said, manually based on qualitative research. So some influencers, like the main one in Brazil, Pablo Marçal, who is one of the main emerging far-right politicians in Brazil. He's also the main coach for this universe of digital entrepreneurship. So he is clearly declared far right. And like him, and because of him, he also concentrates a big field around, a hub around him of self-declared far right supporters. So we have in these classifications, when you say that 9 out of 10 are aligned with the far right, we have a range from self-declared to subtle forms of alignment or inclination towards the far right. For example, they follow all the politicians on the economy, including the economy, the minister of the economy, the former one from Bolsonaro government, but they don't follow anyone from the government or from Lula, any progressive influences, because we also have a map of left and liberal and right influencers with thousands of influencers, and then we see who they follow and the type of combining type of interaction. So analyzing one by one, we classify these influencers between self-declared or strongly aligned to subtly aligned to leaning towards the far right.
Thank you very much. And think like Robin, then thinking about like on the side of platform, if you think about the concept of platform liberalism that is on the rise, quoting Gora, Magalhães, and Keller, for example, how can we ensure mechanisms of democratic governance and have X as the main case study, but other companies such as Meta have been pushing away third parties such as fact checkers and trusted flaggers. We saw this in the US like since just last January, like really more visible. And so what would it take for that interpretative and resistance activity from the peripheries to become constitutive governance, not just reaction to the platform power?
I don't think it takes much. So first thing I want to say, when we're thinking about platform liberalism, even in this concept of a liberalism, states have always been both liberal and illiberal. So there has never been a period of liberalism and a period of illiberalism. This happens kind of simultaneously. So you can imagine, when the founding fathers in the US were espousing their values of liberalism, they were also engaged in slavery. So there has never been a period where those two have existed separately. They always go together. And the same can be said of platforms. We often find within the kind of history of technologies, the history of the internet more broadly, and with platforms, that they are on these tracks simultaneously. So there was never a period of liberalism versus a period of illiberalism. Okay, to your other question. It doesn't take much for our activities to be constitutive of governance. We have often recognized, actually, we haven't often recognized, but the right has really recognized this. So when we think in the past about how we talked about attempts to obfuscate content moderation mechanisms done by the right, I remember years and years ago studying 8chan and looking at how they were replacing all of these very offensive terms with the names of technology companies. So a derogatory term for a Jewish person would be then replaced with Google, et cetera, Yahoo. They were doing that to try and limit the ability of these platforms to censor them. So they were kind of engaged in a practice where they were interpreting these rules in ways that were constitutive of governance. We do the same thing, and we need to kind of recognize the power of that. They recognized it a long, long time ago. So right now, TikTok has been taken over by Oracle and a broad range of corporate actors that could be considered conservative in nature. People have immediately started noticing that content that they were served a couple of days ago is not being served to them now. Anti-ICE content, anti-Trump content. They are seeking it out. They are referring to these types of actions in coded terms. All of that is constitutive of governance itself. It's impacting how the rules are applied, how they are enforced in totality.
Thank you. Now we have like a couple of questions from the audience. I'll do my best to navigate in here. We have a question from Andre. Thanks, Andre. Hello, my name is Andre, and I also study disinformation. What the presenters think about the infrastructure component of disinformation? So it can be a question for both of you if you are comfortable answering. So companies specialized in this type of communication, think tanks that train and teach political influencers how to better monetize their production, troll farms selling reach and influence campaigns, government offices and workers paid with public funds to organize and feed networks of disinformation. So if you have any comments on that, please.
I can think about it from the history of media. So I often disinformation has always been a problem, and it has always been one that is infrastructural. In the past, it has kind of seemed a little bit more top down in terms of how we have studied disinformation. We have looked at it in terms of how political narratives get taken up in media. Now it feels a little bit more dispersed because it is the infrastructure there is tries to make it look like it is more grassroots and bottom up. But yeah, I think like the important thing to always think about is kind of how to situate these activities historically. Jonathan Corpusong does a really great work on this in the context of the Philippines, where he has looked at the connection between these farms and the state in ways that I think other researchers haven't been able to fully capture.
Thank you. Rosanna, do you want to comment on this one?
No, thanks. I'll skip this one.
Then I have like two questions, one for each of you. I start with you, Rosanna. So from Mateus Albuquerque, wondering how you imagine your work resonates on masculinity studies, as masculinity studies about authoritarianism have been focused on the negative emotions like rage, anger, hate, which are all true. How perceiving positive emotions help us to complexify common individuals, and how do you differ common individuals to radicalized individuals in your research?
How do you define what individuals? Sorry, the last
How
sentence.
do you differentiate, I think, common individuals and the radicalized individuals?
Common. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Mateus. In fact, my research has a strong focus on gender, and when I'm discussing, usually when I'm discussing, indeed, just agreeing with you, when I'm discussing rage, I'm usually discussing patriarchal rage, and discussing masculinity, especially this sense of broken universe that these angry white men, the stereotype of the angry white man, feels to collapse. That he is this everything that he learned how to be is collapsing precisely now. But at the same time, my point is only to say that the rage, the anger, resentment are not sustainable alone. Nobody can only sustain an ideological view just based on rage and resentment. So then we have the role of positive emotions also trying to be someone, to be again the breadwinner, to be the man of the family, to regain visibility and authority. When I talk about about positive emotions, I also am talking about aspirations, and it is not a gendered issue. It can, because it can be gendered, but in this case is also very masculine in the way that it hinders the wounded masculinity of these men. And the way to heal, the way to cope with invisibility is through the search of money and visibility and wealth, etc. And the second question is also very interesting, and I don't have a definitive answer, because something that I'm always thinking about and changing. There is no fixed line or a bit fixed boundary between ordinary voters and radicalized and or non-radicalized and radicalized voters. The line is very blurred, and I've been navigating these across this line in very difficult ways, because but what I'm trying to, when I say ordinary voters, I'm talking about people who once voted for Lula, or people who disliked the politics, people who voted for Bolsonaro, but they don't engage in demonstrations, for example. They are not activists themselves. We know that people who study far right, especially ethnographers, they join these movements, they join the demonstrations, they study, they organize the group. So I'm studying people who are not organized, but many times they are really activists in terms of sharing news, and then the line becomes very blurred. It's very hard to navigate this type of research, but I always try to stay with those who are not radicalized, especially joining those who don't join any specific organized movement.
That's great. Thank you. And then Robin, for you from Tracy Belanger, because so many individuals do not understand the black box of how platforms are created, it's easy to blame people like Musk and Zuckerberg, but what is the way to put some of the governance back into the hands of community members?
So this is a really interesting question, because I think what most people don't understand is when we think about the black box of algorithms, most of the time the companies themselves do not understand the black box of algorithms. Those systems are made over the course of years. There's a lot of different teams. They are built on top of each other. And so when we talk in those terms, when we expect that this entity over here also understands this black box, we are kind of misunderstanding the problem as well. In a kind of more concrete sense, though, we can, I hate that the question disappears as soon as you start answering. What's the easiest way to put some of the governance back into the hands of the community members? When users interpret how rules operate and how they are enforced, they are influencing how the algorithm functions. So there's a couple of different ways that I have studied this. So the first one was I did a study on YouTube and demonetization and how that impact creators. One way that creators tried to influence this problem was that they spoke about it. They spoke about it with their audiences. So they would speak out loud. That created a system where, Other creators also felt comfortable speaking out loud. They would share practices for how to get around the algorithms. One very kind of strangely dystopian thing started happening where they started using code words, as often happens, but this was all during COVID, and they were trying to they were demonetizing COVID content at the time because they thought it would limit misinformation. And so YouTubers at that point just kept referring like really vaguely to the situation in a way that like felt very unsettling at the time. But whenever you're kind of sharing information, even if it's not how the algorithms work in practice, when you're sharing information on a broad enough scale, you're going to influence how those algorithms are functioning or how other kind of community members are operating within that system as well. I've also studied this within the context of mutual aid practices on TikTok. The paper that I shared, I shared this paper through my talk. I did it with Elena Maris and Hibby Thatch. And we looked at how users on TikTok were trying to reorient the creator fund toward practices and issues that they valued. And so they were doing a couple of different things. Firstly, they were trying to make use of how the platform operated in ways that they thought they understood. They would use makeup videos, thinking that that's what the platform prioritized, but they would include audio about kind of political issues and needs over top of it to make it kind of look like they were just doing a normal TikTok video, but they were kind of engaged in their own practice of awareness. They would try and work within the comment systems to push the videos up within TikTok's algorithm as well. So those were also still acts of interpretation. They did not know whether or not using exclamation points or asking questions actually functioned as to do that. But when enough people started doing it, yes, it starts kind of influencing not just how the algorithms might operate, but that community-based care, that the people who are reading those comments know that other people care about these topics, and then they feel kind of freer to care as well and to support and become connected. In both cases, I would say that's constitutive of governance.
Thank you. Rosanna, do you want to say something?
No, thanks.
Okay,
I leave
just like making sure.
I leave this answer for today's specialist.
And then I'll do my best to translate this one because Mileni Emiliano Gonzaga is asking a question for each of you. So Mileni says, thank you for the presentations. Rosanna, in the ethnographic research you're conducting, is there a limit on the number of platforms being ethnographic? And then in which media the research is being conducted? And for Robin, if you could talk a little bit more about what kind of platform that exists, or if it is still like doesn't exist, we could imagine in which like the flow of networks of sociability in the internet could converge. So yeah, thanks, Melanie. I hope I did a good job.
Thank you. So this is a large project studying 7 sectors of labor precariousness and low-income groups occupations. So we have in 3 countries, and many people study in different countries and parts. So it varies a lot according to the country and the sector. For example, when we are talking about domestic cleaners, platformed domestic cleaners in the Philippines, we are analyzing, we are studying Facebook, because the whole messages and political content and exchanges still happen because for us it's different in Brazil. It is on Facebook. But when you talk about digital entrepreneurship in Brazil, we are talking mostly, and this is new phenomenon after the pandemic, we are talking mostly about Instagram. Today in Brazil, 70% of business have some presence on Instagram, and this is a phenomenon that is growing. This is official data from SEBRAE, from Brazilian government, from an agency linked to official agents of trade in Brazil, and commerce and trade and entrepreneurship in Brazil. So this is a phenomenon, but also the Instagram is also showing some limits. So we are also migrating to TikTok. In India, for example, we use a lot Instagram. So it depends on the sector. For example, as I mentioned, for digital sellers, Instagram is a very important platform. But for digital cleaners in the Philippines, it's Facebook groups. So it depends. We are covering Twitter, TikTok, Facebook, and Instagram, and also YouTube.
Thank you.
This is such a great question, and I'm not sure I have like a truly coherent answer to this. I was thinking about that a little bit. This talk that I gave today was based on a book chapter I wrote and I finished maybe a week ago. So it's really, really fresh in my head. So I haven't really thought through like all of the implications of what this means in terms of the platforms that we would want to build. I think that, you know, a platform that would help us enact these kind of values or would be one that's interoperable, one where we could port data, one where kind of the relationship to the ownership of our data is fundamentally different, one that is owned by the people. I think that that's kind of where I would begin. I wouldn't kind of imagine a platform that we could build that would exist without rules or that would exist kind of purely according to democratic rules. I think that kind of give and take is actually part of what is so powerful about community governance is that a lot of it is in kind of opposition. When we imagine that we can kind of create a platform with rules that would serve all, there's just no way that that would ever possibly happen. So yeah, it's a great question, and I think as I work more on this, I'll start thinking more. I'll start thinking a little bit more creatively.
These are great. And we do have other questions, but unfortunately we don't have time. But we are collecting all the questions so everyone knows. And then we'll do like our best to kind of address them in the report and suggest readings, including from our speakers, that can help answer this, especially this ones over here. And we really, really appreciate all the time and effort you put into this, despite the snowstorm and the time zone. So thank you very much. I'm sure like everyone learned it a lot. I learned it a lot with and from you. And thanks again. Yasmin?
So thank you so much, Hosanna and Robin, for this excellent discussion. And thank you also to the audience for keeping up with us here. We had one of the biggest turnouts of the series today, reaching 130 people. So we really appreciate having you all here. If you'd like to stay connected with us, considering joining our DTG Lab mailing list and follow our website. We have a page for the project there. You can keep up with the next sessions as well. Take care and see you next time. Thank you so much once again.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure to be with you.
Yeah, thank you for everyone for coming and to the organizers especially.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.